Chapter 9 of Headlong Hall by Thomas Love Peacock. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Chapter 9. The Sexton. Mr. Escott passed a sleepless night, the ordinary effect of love, according to some amatory poets, who seem to have composed their whining ditties for the benevolent purpose of bestowing on others that gentle slumber of which they so pathetically lament the privation. The deteriorationist entered into a profound moral soliloquy, in which he first examined whether a philosopher ought to be in love. Having decided this point affirmatively against Plato and Lucretius, he next examined whether that passion ought to have the effect of keeping a philosopher awake. Having decided this negatively, he resolved to go to sleep immediately. Not being able to accomplish this to his satisfaction, he tossed and tumbled, like Achilles or Orlando, first on one side, then on the other, repeated to himself several hundred lines of poetry, counted 1,000, began again, and counted another 1,000, in vain. The beautiful Cephalus was the predominant image in all his soliloquies, in all his repetitions, even in the numerical process from which he sought relief. He did but associate the idea of number with that of his dear tormentor, till she appeared to his mind's eye in 1,000 similitudes, distinct, not different. These 1,000 images, indeed, were but one, and yet the one was 1,000, a sort of uni-multiplex phantasma, which will be very intelligible to some understandings. He arose with the first peep of day, and sallied forth to enjoy the balmy breeze of morning, which any but a lover might have thought too cool, for it was an intense frost, the sun had not risen, and the wind was rather fresh from the north-east and by north. But a lover, who, like Laodeland in the Curse of Kahama, always has, or at least is always supposed to have, a fire in his heart and a fire in his brain, feels a wintry breeze from north-east and by north steal over his cheek like the south over a bank of violets. Therefore on walked the philosopher, with his coat unbuttoned and his hat in his hand, careless of whither he went, till he found himself near the enclosure of a little mountain chapel. Passing through the wicket and stepping over 2 or 3 graves, he stood on a rustic tombstone and peered through the chapel window, examining the interior with as much curiosity as if he had forgotten what the inside of a church was made of, which, it is rather to be feared, was the case. Before him and beneath him were the font, the altar, and the grave, which gave rise to a train of moral reflections on the 3 great epochs in the course of the featherless biped, birth, marriage, and death. The middle stage of the process arrested his attention, and his imagination placed before him several figures which he thought, with the addition of his own, would make a very picturesque group. The beautiful Cephalus, arrayed in her bridal apparel of white, her friend Caprioletta officiating as bridesmaid, Mr. Cranium giving her away, and last, not least, the Reverend Dr. Gaster, intoning the marriage ceremony with the regular orthodox allowance of nasal recitative. Whilst he was feasting his eyes on this imaginary picture, the demon of mistrust insinuated himself into the storehouse of his conceptions, and, removing his figure from the group, substituted that of Mr. Panscope, which gave such a violent shock to his feelings, that he suddenly exclaimed, with an extraordinary elevation of voice,
"Me miserable, and thrice miserable, and 4 times, and 5 times, and 12 times, and 10,000 times miserable!"
to the great terror of the sexton, who was just entering the churchyard, and not knowing from whence the voice proceeded, which he took for the devil, the sight of the philosopher dispelled his apprehensions, when, growing suddenly valiant, he immediately addressed him.
"Oh, God bless your honour! Oh, I shouldn't have thought of meeting anybody here at this time of the morning, except, look you, it was the devil, who, to be sure, does not often come upon consecrated ground. But for all that, I think I have seen him now and then, in former days, when old Nanny Llywyd of Llynisa was living. God deliver us, a terrible old witch, to be sure she was. I didn't much like taking her grave, but I brought 2 cocks with me. The devil hates cocks, and tied them by the leg on 2 tombstones. And I tug, and the cocks crowed, and the devil kept at a distance. To be sure now, if I hadn't been very brave by nature, as I ought to be truly, for my father was Owen ap Llywyd ap Griffith ap Shenkin ap Williams ap Thomas ap Morgan ap Parry ap Evan ap Rhys, a good preacher and a lover of cwrw. I should have thought just now, before I saw your honour, that the voice I heard was the devil's calling Nanny Llywyd. God bless us, to be sure, she should have been buried in the middle of the river, where the devil can't come, as your honour very well knows.
I am perfectly aware of it,
said Mr. Escott.
True, true,
continued the sexton.
But to be sure, Owen Thomas of Morbabach will have it that one summer evening, when he went over to Cwmcanfail in Meirionydd about some cattles he wanted to buy, he saw a strange figure, bless us, with 5 horns, God save us, sitting on Hugh Llywyd's pulpit, which your honour very well knows is a big rock in the middle of the river.
Of course he was mistaken,
said Mr. Escott.
To be sure he was,
said the sexton.
For there is no doubt but the devil, when Owen Thomas saw him, must have been sitting on a piece of rock in a straight line from him on the other side of the river, where he used to sit, look you, for a whole summer's day, while Hugh Llywyd was on his pulpit, and there they used to talk across the water, for Hugh Llywyd, please your honour, never raised the devil, except when he was safe in the middle of the river, which proves that Owen Thomas, in his fright, didn't pay proper attention to the exact spot where the devil was.
The sexton concluded his speech with an approving smile at his own sagacity, in so luminously expounding the nature of Owen Thomas's mistake.
I perceive,
said Mr. Escott.
You have a very deep insight into things, and can therefore perhaps facilitate the resolution of a question concerning which, though I have little doubt on the subject, I am desirous of obtaining the most extensive and accurate information.
The sexton scratched his head, the language of Mr. Escott not being to his apprehension quite so luminous as his own.
You have been sexton here,
continued Mr. Escott in the language of Hamlet.
Man and boy, 40 years.
The sexton turned pale. The period Mr. Escott named was so nearly the true one that he began to suspect the personage before him of being rather too familiar with Hugh Lloyd's sable visitor. Recovering himself a little, he said,
Why, thereabouts, sure enough.
During this period you have of course dug up many bones of the people of ancient times.
Bones? God bless you. Yes, bones as old as the earth.
Perhaps you can show me a few.
The sexton grinned horribly a ghastly smile.
Oh, will you take your Bible oath you don't want them to raise the devil with?
Willingly,
said Mr. Escott, smiling.
I have an abstruse reason for the inquiry.
Ah, why, if you have an obtuse reason,
said the sexton, who thought this a good opportunity to show that he could pronounce hard words as well as other people.
If you have an obtuse reason, that alters the case.
So saying, he led the way to the bone house, from which he began to throw out bones and skulls of more than common dimensions, and amongst them a skull of very extraordinary magnitude, which he swore by St. David was the skull of Cadwallader.
How do you know this to be his skull?
Said Mr. Escott.
He was the piggest man that ever lived, and he was buried here, and this is the piggest skull I ever found. You see now.
Nothing can be more logical,
said Mr. Escott.
My good friend, will you allow me to take this skull away with me?
Oh, St. Winifred bless us!
Exclaimed the sexton.
Would you have me haunted by his ghost for taking his blessed pawns out of consecrated ground? Would you have him come in the dead of the night and fly away with the roof of my house? Would you have all the crop of my garden come to nothing? Oh, for look you, his epitaph says, "He that my pawns shall ill bestow, leek in his ground shall never grow." Oh.
You will ill bestow them,
said Mr. Escott,
in confounding them with those of the sons of little men, the degenerate dwarfs of later generations. You will well bestow them in giving them to me, for I will have this illustrious skull bound with a silver rim, and filled with mantling wine, with this inscription, Nunc Tandem, signifying that that pernicious liquor has at length found its proper receptacle. For, when the wine is in, the brain is out.
Saying these words, he put $1 into the hands of the sexton, who instantly stood spellbound by the talismanic influence of the coin, while Mr. Escott walked off in triumph with the skull of Cadwallader. End of chapter 9.